So I've completed my components, and now I would like to go back and straighten up some issues in the timeline. And if you remember, I had two different screws in here. You may only have the one adjustment screw, but I'm going to turn off the visibility of the second screw that I put in here that had the knurled end on it. And so I had this screw that I put in earlier, and I used that to do a combined cut from this handle. Now I want to move that combined cut and the threading of the handle back to earlier in the timeline. So I'll go and find those features, and so here I can see where I deleted a face, and then I put in a thread. I did a chamfer, I did a press pull or offset face on the handle, and I did a combine. So I'm going to select this feature, and I'll control select these features. I'm going to move these back earlier in the timeline, and let's see if I can drag this so that I can see. I might not be able to go far enough, so I'll have to do it in a couple steps. So I'm going to drag this, and I'm going to put it back, and I want to put it back into a particular location, but I can't get far enough. I'll just drop it here. Now when I dropped it, I get an error message, and we should always take care of these error messages as they occur. Don't leave them unresolved. And so I'll go back to the beginning of my timeline, and I see that it actually dropped those features before the imported components. And so I'll select these features again, and then I'm going to drag this, and I want to put this on the other side of where I did a fixed constraint on each of those three components. So we see now that the issue has been resolved. So never ignore the yellow or red highlighted issues. Resolve those issues immediately. Now I'm going to bring the timeline, and actually the fastest way, so I want to get back to right before this combine, and the fastest way to do that is just to go all the way back to the beginning, and then I'll step forward. So I brought in these components, and I made a component from each one. So I have the stationary handle, the stationary jaw, and I have the moving jaw, and then I have the adjustment screw, and I grounded then the adjustment screw, the stationary handle, and the stationary jaw. So I grounded those, and then I removed a face, a chamfer on this screw, and I put a new thread on there, or physical thread rather than a cosmetic thread, and then I put a chamfer on, and I combined that to cut from this. And first I moved this face to increase that chamfer size, so I have a lead in here. And so I would really like to combine the screw, the adjustment screw, and the stationary handle and the stationary jaw into a subassembly. Now really we didn't even really need that adjustment screw to combine cut from here. We should have just used the thread feature or a hole with a tapped thread in it to cut that. But I demonstrated how to use that, so I'm going to leave that in here. But I'm going to make an attempt. Now this attempt may fail. We'll see how this goes. So I created a component I call stationary handle subassembly, and what I would like to do, I have another file open here where I have a subassembly. I would like to drag the component, and notice if I move it over that, it highlights that subassembly, and drop it into that subassembly. So in this case I've dropped these two components into this subassembly. When I try to do it on this one though, so I have this subassembly, and I try to drop it there, it doesn't highlight and it doesn't allow me to drop it. And I tried several different techniques and I couldn't get that to work. And so I'm not sure what I would have to do at this point to get this component and the tool body adjustment screw that I used into that subassembly. So I can't get that to work, so I'm going to delete the subassembly that I made. And when I did that, some things became sick, and so I probably need to go back and just undo back to where I did that step. So I'll just undo back to where everything was still okay. So before that subassembly. Alright, so I'm back to where everything is still okay, and I'm not sure why I'm not able to create that subassembly, but we'll tackle this in a different way. I think what I'll do instead is I'm going to put these three components into a rigid group. And I'm going to do that before I did any features on those components. So I'll come back, and I'll go back before I even grounded any components, and I will select the adjustment screw and the stationary jaw and the stationary handle. I'll right click, and I'm going to create a rigid group with those components. Alright, then I put a grounded on this component, and I could also make a rigid group between this component and the top level of the assembly rather than do a fixed constraint. And so now that I've done a rigid group, I shouldn't need this fixed constraint on here, so I'm going to delete that. And if I try to drag this, we see that it doesn't move because it's part of that rigid group. And I'll come down to the next one, and again, if I delete that fixed constraint and I try to drag this, it doesn't move because it's part of that grounded group. On the other hand, if I were to delete, and I thought I deleted that one, I think I got the wrong one, so let's undo that and make sure I get the right one. Oh, I see what I'm doing here. I need to so this was the handle, and that was the jaw, and then this one was the fixed screw. Okay, so now I've got that the way I want it. And if I should unground this and I move this, we see that those three components move together the way I'd expect them to. So I'm going to undo that. I don't actually want to do that. I just wanted to demonstrate that these three components are now a rigid group that moves together. Now, I might mark those also as grounded just so that I can see that they are grounded. I would like to really have one of the components moving jaw after this adjustment screw, but we'll just leave that where it's at. So I'm going to go forward, make sure that I have no errors in these features that I added for the threading, and then I'm going to play this back to the end. So I'll send this all the way to the end and make sure that I don't have any errors coming up. And then I'm going to start to put some of the joints in here. And so I'm going to turn on the visibility of the knurled screw that I put in here. So this one has a complex pattern on here for printing it out. If I don't need that pattern, I just use a cosmetic knurl on here to save computational time. So I want to put a joint between this component and the handle, and I may want to do that earlier on. So again, I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I'm going to go to forward, and I brought that component in really late, and so I may need to go and find that. So I'll go back to the end, and I want to bring that down to here if I can, or actually I lost the position here, but so let's see where I brought that part in. And to help find that part, I'm going to go up to inspection, and I'll select components, color cycle, toggle, and so I see this component, and I'll come down here, and so here is the adjustment screw, and then I put a chamfer on the end of it. So I'm going to select this one, and I'll select this one if I can get both of them, and then I'm going to drag those back in the timeline towards the beginning. And so I didn't get that, so I'll try it again. So I'm going to drag this back in the timeline. I'm still not getting it. Let's drag it back to here. And so I can't get it to come back earlier in the timeline. So I'd hoped to move that earlier. There may be a way. I'll have to come up with some other strategy. So if I drag this, we see that it can go anywhere. And what I want to do is put a joint between this component and this component. And so I'm going to either do J for joint, or you can come up to the Assemble tab, and I'll go ahead and capture the position, but then I'm going to remove that capture position because I don't really want it out here. So I'll do capture position, and then I'm going to select the cylindrical face of this pin right here, and then I'm going to select a cylindrical face inside here, and I don't want a rigid joint. I want that to be a revolution joint, so I'll select revolution. And actually I want this to be able to revolve, and I want it to be able to translate, and so I'll do a cylindrical rather than a revolution. So I'll do cylindrical. It shows that it can translate, and maybe we'll be able to see it rotate as well. I'll tell it to animate that again, and we can see that it can rotate. So it has rotation and translation. We'll say OK to that. Now when it did that, we did this capture history, which I really don't want the capture history, or the position, the caption position. So I'm going to delete this. And let's see if we can move this screw out here. And so we have a rotational translation. I'm then going to drag some of these components out here so that we can see more clearly what's going on. And I want to put this component into the hole for the jaw that doesn't move, for the stationary jaw. And so I'm going to do J for joint. We can come up and select. I'll tell it to capture position, and I've got this component in here as well, and I want to make sure I don't get that component. Let me drag this component out of the way. I then want to do a joint between the center of this cylinder and this hole up here. And so I can't select the cylinder, the center of it, unless I hold down the control key. Then I can get the cylinder, the center of that cylinder. And then here I have a hole on this side and a hole over on this side. I need midway in between those two, so I'm going to select between two faces. And I can't select this face since it isn't planar, but I can select this face, and I can select this face. And then I need to select my cylinder, and we'll see back there is the coordinate system at the intersection, or the intersection of the axis of this hole and the midplane between those two faces. So I'll select here, and if we look around, we see that it just rotates around that point. Let's say OK to that. And I can test it out now, and so this jaw just rotates, it doesn't translate. And I'm going to delete this capture position. I'm going to delete these as I go along. And actually that moved everything back to where it was. So I'll delete all the capture positions at the end after I have everything all assembled. Now I want to put this pin up here into this hole, and so I will do J for join, and I'll do the capture position, and I'll select the midpoint or center point of this cylinder, and then I'll select the center point of this cylinder, and I will need to hold down the control key and select that diamond, and so that will move that together, and I'll say OK to that. Now I think I changed the width of this pin from here to here. I had some interference, so you may need to edit this pin in order to increase that distance such that there isn't any interference between this face and that face on that pin. Now technically I could ground this pin if I want to, because it doesn't move now. Alright, so the next component that I'm going to put in here is I'm going to put this hole into that hole. And so I'll do J for join, and then I need to get mid-plane between two faces, and I might have trouble on this one because I don't believe that there are two planar faces on this one. Let's select between two planes, and so it doesn't allow me to select anything on this, and so I'm going to need to go back to some of the geometry that we used to create this in order to get that plane. So I'm going to edit the clamping handle, and I'm going to make one of the sketches visible that I have, and actually I may be able to use this point right here on the sketch. So let's go back to the top level of the assembly, and then I'll do J for join, and I will then for the snap position I'm going to select this sketch point and pay attention to the location or orientation of that round disc. So the z-axis is perpendicular to that round disc, so I want this point selected like that, and then I will hold down the shift key or the control key, and I'll get this diamond that moves that coordinate system, and I have a revolution joint. I'll say OK to that, and then I want to put one of these pins into that location as well. Let's go ahead and hide that sketch. We don't need to see that sketch anymore. So I can hide that sketch. I'll do J for join, and I will select the midpoint of this cylinder, and I will, with the control key, I'll get the midpoint of this cylinder, and that moves that into position. And again, I think I increased the width of this, and actually it looks like there's a little bit of interference right in here, so I may need to increase that pin distance. So let's find that pin. I'll right click and I'll say find in browser, and then I'm going to edit this lock pin, and so I'll go to the sketch and I'll edit that sketch, and I'll add a little bit of distance. So let's do that as 0.48 to increase that distance between here and here. And so now I see a line going around there. I think actually that's the wrong one. I need to get this one. Actually, that's the one I just edited. And so it was originally created up here, and so once we said OK, we see it down here in the position where we want it. Alright, and so we see that we start to have some expected motion between the components. Now what we might do is ground these components, or one of them, temporarily, or we could put a limit in here to limit the motion of say this rotational joint. So let's go back and find the revolution joint for this, and at some point I turned on a work plane 2, so I'll go to that clamping handle and I'll turn off the origin, and then I'm going to go back and find that revolution joint, and I need to find the one for so there's one here for this pin, and there's one here for this component. I believe I put that one in first. Right click and I'll do edit joint limits, and then I'll set a minimum and a maximum. I'll put in 0 here, and I'll put in -30. Okay, so that'll allow that to open up 30 degrees, and I'll set a resting position at 0, and we'll say OK to that, and we'll test it out. And so it goes up, it comes back down, and when I release it, it goes back to its resting position of 0. Alright, next I want to put in this component, and so I'll do joint, and again I'm going to need a center point for this hole because this actually isn't a cylindrical hole the way we made it, and this isn't a planar face, so we need the sketch point in order to locate that. So I'll go to the clamp handle and I'll turn on the visibility of the sketches. I'll do J for joint, and I'll select the point on that sketch, and then I'm going to come to this component. I'll go to the cylinder, I'll hold down the control key, I'll get that triangular shape. We'll say OK to that. And so we test this out a little bit. So we have a revolution for this one, and let's put this one up here so that the center of this face stays on the center of this face, and that's going to be a little bit of a fudge that I'll put in here in order to get that to work. So I'll do J for join, and I'm going to select the center of this face, and then I'm going to select the center of this face, and for the joint that I'm going to put on here I will use a ball joint. So that has 3 degrees of 3 revolution degrees of freedom on this end, but because we put the revolution joint on this end, that removes 2 of those degrees of freedom of revolution. So I'll say OK to that, and we'll test this out. Okay, so now this moves like we would expect it to, and then the next thing I want to do is put this component into this hole, and we can do this in either order. I guess I'll go ahead and put the pin in here first. I'm trying to decide where to put the pin in here. I still need to put this pin. Let's go ahead and get this pin. So I'll do J for join, and I'll capture that position. I'm going to get the midpoint of this cylinder, and I'll get this point, and I want that one to be a revolution, and then I'll go ahead and put this pin in. So I'm still debating whether I should put this pin in first. Let's go ahead and, well, let's put it in. We'll put this one in first. So I'll go to the cam lock release, and I'll turn on the visibility of the sketches. I'll do J for join. I'm going to select this point and constrain that to this point. I want that as a revolution joint. I'll say OK to that, and then I'll do the pin. So I'll do J for join. I will select the midpoint of the cylinder, and I will get this point, and there's 2 points there. It doesn't matter really which one we get, although I might want to make that a rigid joint with this. So I'll go ahead and select this, and that'll move that into position. Let's turn off the visibility of the sketches. So I'll turn off those sketches, and I'll turn off these sketches. I still have some sketches visible on the clamping handle. Okay, I'm going to make these 2 move together. So I'll select this component, I'll hold down the control key, I'll select this component, and I'll right click, and I'm going to and I thought I could put those 2 together as a rigid group, and I'm not seeing it over here, so we'll try to do it over here. So I've got the roll pin and the, actually let's go make sure that up here that we're at the top level, and then I'll select the roll pin and the cam lock release. Actually, I want this component and the clamping handle and the roll pin, and I don't see an option here to, oh, here we are, rigid group. That might have been there all along. Yes. Okay, so this component still can move. These components move. So I want to add some connection points on this spring. So I've made this spring my active component. I'll turn on the visibility of the origin, and so this plane goes through the center of the spring. I'm going to create a sketch on this plane, and then I'll do P for project, and I'm going to select this face, and I'll select this axis, and I'll say OK to project those pieces of geometry. I'm then going to draw a line from the midpoint of this projected circle, and I'll put this down here someplace, and I'm just eyeballing that location for where I want that, and I want to make sure that that though has a vertical or horizontal constraint on it. And so I'm going to make my connection point about here, and then I want a connection point up here, and we'll see how this goes. It may or may not work. I'll draw a line up to about that location, and so we see I have a point up here at that location. I'll turn off the visibility of the origin, and I'll finish sketch. And it's been a while since I saved this, so I'll make sure I save it. Then I'll do J for join, and I'm going to select this point right here. I'll select that point, and I will come down here, and I want to hold the control key and get this triangle, and so that will move that point. And so I can move this point further this way to move it towards that end, or down closer to the edge of the loop. I'll go ahead and say OK to this one, and let's drag this around, and let's try moving it closer to the center. And so if I go back to that spring and I edit this sketch, I'm going to drag this down. Actually, this is going to be where the center of that loop is. So let's drag this down here, and I may even want to bring it down here further. We'll say OK to that and see what it looks like. And so now we've moved that spring, the center of it, and that looks pretty good right there. I might have a little bit of interference. And while I'm on the subject of interference, I also noticed that I have a little bit of interference right here and right here. So back where we created the surface, before we thickened it, if we trim off, use say a rectangle to trim off an edge along here, over, up, and trim off those two edges, that will eliminate that interference. And when I did this, I also see that I have I need a different size pin here than I have here. So I may need to create a third pin size to put another pin in that location. I thought these two were the same size. Apparently they're not, because I have too much of clearance between there. So I think that you know how to do that, so I'm going to leave that for you to do. Now I'm still trying to figure out how I could constrain the other end of this spring, and there may not be a good way to do that. Let's go back into our analysis, our section analysis. Well, I thought I might be able to come up with a clever way of putting a slider joint between a point going through this axis and then a sketch that I put up here, so that this would just slide back and forth here. When I tried that though, I got an error, and so I gave up on that. You might be able to come up with a clever way of overcoming that issue as well. So I'm going to turn off my analysis, and I'll also turn off the sketches that I made in attempting to get that slider joint. And I also have origin plane, so I have a sketch in the spring. So I'll go to the spring and I'll turn off the visibility of that sketch, and I'll go back to my inspection and I'll turn off the color cycling. There is our assembly with everything put together, and it more or less moves. I'd like to figure out a way to get that spring so that it doesn't come out of there. I guess I could do a contact between the spring and this part. Let's go ahead and try that. Well, my idea for a contact isn't going to work because it's already in contact right here. If I lengthen the spring a little bit, I guess I could then use a contact where it comes up and hits this. That would keep it inside. But we have a good representation. We would have to do some clever workarounds in order to get this fully operational. I almost forgot that there were a bunch of capture positions in here which I really don't need, and so I'm going to go through and I'll delete these capture positions. Now I may need to move something after I've done that, and so let's move this around along its remaining degree of freedom. And then I have some more capture positions. Let's see, so here's one, here's one. I don't know if there is a single hotkey to remove all of those capture positions. I think I have them all. And let's move this spring back down a little bit. So our jaw moves. And I'm still, even as I do this, I'm trying to think of a way that I could cleverly keep this spring, and maybe if I could keep it parallel to this face, then that would make that look nice. And then also put a motion such that when this moves, the screw actually rotates.